The agenda today, and this would be a good opportunity to just quickly introduce the main AEMO people on the call to you. So starting with myself, Oliver Derham, I'm the FPP business lead. I'm in the reform delivery area of AEMO, along with Chris Muffet, who is the manager of wholesale reform delivery. Chris will be giving the introduction and opening comments shortly. We also have Heidi Cummings, who is in Chris's team. Heidi will be taking us through the main, I'll call it the bigger half of the agenda, which is talking about what is the point of this reform, where does it come from, and how is it going to work. We will all be aided in that by the expertise of Sahand Karimi, who is from the operations division of AEMO, and in particular the team that will have be the ongoing business owners of FPP. So yeah, we're grateful to have Sahand's expertise today to answer your thorniest questions. Then I will talk about the remaining stages of the reform implementation process. And if we have any time after that, we can talk about anything we haven't covered. I will just also emphasize here that we really, really want you to ask every question that you have and for this to be very conversational. If you're more comfortable putting questions in the chat, do them, and where possible, I think we'll address them as we go while we're on that area of the material. And also, if you want to make a comment, put your hand up. But I think on that note, I will hand over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Ollie. And welcome everyone to this information session. I can see a number of familiar faces in the call today, but for those of you I haven't met before, my name is Chris Muffet. I look after the wholesale reform within AEMO, and in particular I chair a number of forums that are part of AEMO's NEM reform program. For those of you who aren't aware, the NEM reform program is a collaboration between AEMO and the industry to deliver the key reforms necessary to support the energy transition, and that includes the pathways that were called out by the ESB as part of their post-2025 design. And I'm sure many of you will be aware of the reforms that are underway at the moment, as well as some of the rule changes that are currently proceeding at the moment that ultimately AEMO will be looking after and implementing alongside you as the industry. This information session today is going to specifically focus on the FPP reform. From my perspective, FPP is a really important reform to ensure that we have the appropriate incentives for frequency control now and into the future, and in particular as we head into the energy transition and we see that progressive shift from, I guess, the traditional fleet of generation to, I guess, a generation fleet that is marked by renewable energy and storage of different types. I guess one of the challenges of this reform is that the new arrangements are complex. They build on the existing cause of pays regime, which in itself is quite complex. But certainly FPP does take that complexity to a new level. But the key thing here is that the objectives of the reform can only be met if the industry, all of you, understand how it works and can make informed decisions about, in particular, how you operate your plant, how you may invest in technologies into the future. That's a really important part of what this reform is looking to achieve. The critical component of making those informed decisions is data. And so AEMO is building many new data feeds to provide transparency to how these how this FPP arrangement will work, how the calculations are performed. That includes both in the real time, but also through the settlement process. And it's really critical that you understand how that data is going to work and how you can get access to that data and build it into your systems to make sure that you're making the most informed decisions possible about the operation of your plant. So this stakeholder session is really supporting that objective, along with all of our other stakeholder activities. We're really focusing on providing participants with the information that they need to successfully operate under the FPP arrangements. And so we really hope as part of this that you can progressively develop that understanding of how this arrangement is going to work, so that when the arrangements do go live progressively from the end of this year and then formally mid next year, that you are well placed to be able to use that data and make informed decisions that ultimately give us the best frequency control going forward. As Ollie pointed out, very much welcome questions in the chat, recognising that we do have a large number of people on the call, so the chat I think will be really useful for people to pop their thoughts in as we go, and we'll endeavour to answer those questions as we proceed. But without further ado, hand back over to you, Ollie, to get the session started. Thank you.
I was on mute, but I didn't start talking, so I feel like I didn't do the thing then. Thank you, Chris. That's a fabulous introduction. I don't think there's anything more to say other than to hand it over to Heidi to take us through an overview of FPP and how it's going to work.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name's Heidi Cummings, and I'm a member of the Wholesale Reform Delivery team, working with Ollie and Chris on the FPP reform. Today, I'll be talking through the development behind the AEMC rule change that triggered the FPP reform, the calculation process involved, as well as the impacts on participants and how these can be improved. As mentioned, questions are welcomed, and Sahand, a member of AEMO's systems commercial team and our leading expert on the FPP process, will be supporting me to address these. So firstly, I'd like to begin with a bit of a background context to the development of this reform. The FPP reform can be viewed as a direct outcome of the 2022 AEMC Primary Frequency Response Incentive Rule change. The rule established an enduring framework to control the power system frequency, a function that has been a critical component of the NEM's normal operation since its initiation. Frequency varies whenever electricity supply does not exactly match consumer demand. The more unstable frequency becomes, the greater the risk of negative events on the power system, including units tripping off and, in worst case scenarios, outages that leave consumers without power. Hence, stable frequency is an important part of maintaining a secure power system. In the national electricity market, there are a number of obligations and market mechanisms that help balance the energy supply and demand and support the stability of system frequency. The first is primary frequency response, or PFR. This is an automatic, immediate response to frequency deviations that units provide to stabilize the frequency within seconds of any disturbance. Secondary frequency control refers to regulation FCAS, a slower, more sustained response that involves automatic generation control, or AGC. Through AGC, AEMO can adjust the output of selected units to correct frequency deviations within minutes. Finally, greater frequency response is provided in response to power system events through contingency FCAS. To begin with, there was a large supply of PFR, as most of the large synchronous generators were mandated to provide it. In 2001, the FCAS markets were implemented, and the causer pays framework was established to recover costs of regulation FCAS from those who caused the need for it. Now, with the implementation of FCAS, the provision of PFR was no longer mandated. During the 2010s, generators began to deactivate their PFR capabilities, and at the same time, the energy mix was shifting towards more variable renewable energy, increasing the potential for imbalances between supply and demand that can cause frequency disturbances. This reduction in PFR supply, coupled with an increased need for it, elicited a decline in frequency performance of the NEM. In 2018, the AMC completed a frequency control framework review, which discussed the issue of declining frequency performance, but did not elicit an urgent action. However, the significance of this issue was brought to light after a power system separation event in August of that year. Due to the lack of frequency response to a rest and control power system frequency, the frequency took an unfavorable amount of time to stabilize. AMO also specifically noted that a sufficient supply of PFR could have helped in limiting and preventing some of the counterproductive responses that occurred. Unsurprisingly, 3 rule change requests were then submitted in 2019 regarding the immediate need for improved frequency control in the NEM. In response, the AEMC implemented mandatory PFR in 2020 with a sunset of 2023 and aimed to develop effective incentives for investment in and operation of plants to provide PFR. In 2022, the AEMC published its final PFR incentives rule change. This extended mandatory PFR and introduced a new double-sided system of incentive payments and penalties based on units' impact on system frequency, or as we now refer to it, the FPP process. So, what are the goals of the FPP reform? This can be broken down into 2 parts. The first component involves the introduction of a double-sided frequency performance payment process. This aims to incentivize the provision of PFR by rewarding units that provide helpful frequency performance and penalizing units that have unhelpful impacts on system frequency. Under the FPP system, each participant receives a credit or debit in every 5-minute trading interval based on their performance. The second element of this new procedure refers to enhancing the process of recovering regulation FCAS costs. The current method of allocating these costs to market participants, known as causa pays, will be replaced. Under the FPP reforms, the cost of regulation FCAS will be recovered from units that have a negative impact on system frequency. Each unit will receive a portion of the cost with respect to how unhelpful its frequency performance was. The method by which AMO measures a unit's frequency performance and how this is used to determine both the FPPs and the allocated regulation FCAS costs is outlined in the Frequency Contribution Factors Procedure, or FCFP. This flowchart displayed illustrates the calculation process involved, which is completed every 5-minute trading interval. I will now talk through the elements of this flowchart to clarify how the FPP trading amounts and allocated regulation FCAS costs of market participants are calculated. The first step is to calculate the frequency measure, which reflects the need to raise or lower power system frequency towards 50 Hz. A positive FM means that the frequency should be increased, and a negative FM means the frequency should be decreased. For every region, an FM value is calculated at each 4-second interval using the frequency deviations within that region. A unit's performance is assessed based on the frequency measure and the deviation of the unit from its reference trajectory. A unit's reference trajectory shows its expected active power output or consumption. The reference trajectory of a scheduled and semi-scheduled unit is a straight line between the previous and current dispatch targets. And the reference trajectory of a non-scheduled unit is a continuation of the unit generation at the start of the current trading interval. The next step is to calculate unit deviations. Every 4 seconds, AMO calculates a unit's deviation by comparing SCADA measurements against its reference trajectory. A positive deviation is one that increases the net amount of energy in the system, more generation or less load. And a negative deviation has the opposite effect. The figure presented shows the reference trajectory, 4-second SCADA measurements, and deviations of a unit over 6 trading intervals. As I mentioned, the performance of each unit for a 5-minute trading interval is calculated using its deviations and the frequency measure in that region. The performance of a unit quantifies how much the unit contributes to the frequency control of the power system. This contribution will be either helpful or unhelpful. A unit's frequency performance is deemed helpful when it has a deviation that shares the same sign as the frequency measure, and vice versa for a deviation that opposes the frequency measure. The figure below illustrates this for a generating unit with PFR capability over 6 trading intervals. For each unit, AEMO calculates 2 performance values every 4 seconds, one for when there is a need to increase the system frequency, and the other for when there is a need to lower system frequency. The aggregates of these 4-second performances respectively form the unit's raise and lower performance over the 5-minute trading interval. Following the calculation of raise and lower performances of all units in a trading interval, AEMO normalizes the performances in each regulation FCAS requirement to determine contribution factors. A contribution factor reflects the extent to which the unit contributed to the unhelpful or unhelpful control of system frequency. A contribution factor is valued between -1 and 1, with negative values indicating a unit's unhelpful response and positive values a helpful one. The positive and negative contribution factors will respectively be used to determine the incentives or penalties in the FPP system. AEMO then determines the monetary values for the unit's frequency performance, which are called FPP trading amounts. To do this, we first calculate a factor called Requirement for Corrective Response, or RCR. This shows the capacity value of all helpful deviations in a trading interval and will be used to scale the FPP trading amounts. The figure depicts how RCR corresponds to the maximum of the sum of all helpful deviations, including both units and residual during that interval. The trading amount of a unit is calculated by multiplying its contribution factors by a scaling factor. This scaling factor is based on the RCR and regulation FCAS prices. Moving on to the other part of the procedure, that is the allocation of regulation FCAS costs. The first step is to determine the factor called usage, which reflects the proportion of enabled regulation FCAS that was used within a trading interval. The purpose of this factor is to divide regulation FCAS costs into used and unused costs. To allocate the unused regulation FCAS costs, AEMO uses default contribution factors, or DCFs. DCFs are determined based on the historical performance of units. AEMO calculates raise and lower historical performances for each unit every week based on the unit's performance values over a 7-day historical period. The used regulation FCAS costs are allocated using units' real-time contribution factors. Under the FCFP, the FPP trading amounts and allocated regulation FCAS costs are also calculated for the residual. The residual refers to all facilities connected to the grid without appropriate metering or 4-second SCADA measurements, including small consumers and distributed resources. AEMO aggregates the deviations of all units with appropriate metering and the interconnectors within the region, then takes the opposite of that sum to determine the deviation of the residual. The residual performance is calculated on a regional basis, which is then aggregated to determine the residual contribution factor. The FPP and regulation FCAS recovery trading amounts of participants who are part of the residual are determined based on their total adjusted gross energy amounts. In terms of the system changes and impacts on participants that will result from the FPP reform, there are 2 key components. Firstly, there will be reporting of new data for all eligible generating units via NEM reports and the AEMO data interchange. The second major change refers to the settlement of frequency performance payments. These impacts can be broken down by participant type. Firstly, the cost recovery market participants with units to be individually assessed for FPP will experience a high level of impact. This includes new contribution factors to be calculated each trading interval and reported to plant operator the following interval, default contribution factors to be calculated where necessary, data is unavailable, data for all participants published at the start of the next trading day, FPPs included in settlements, and contribution factors that will inform participation in regulation FCAS offers. Cost recovery market participants without units to be individually assessed for FPP will be moderately impacted by reporting of settlement data, which requires changes to existing participant interfaces, and an overall cost of FCAS to be recovered from participants is expected to increase. And finally, other participant categories such as NSPs and meter providers will be seen to not be directly impacted. I'd like to hand over to Sahand to talk through the net settlements in FPP and regulation aggregated by type.
Thanks, Heidi. So this figure is the result of an analysis that we did last year. The results of this analysis was discussed in detail in a briefing that we had February last year. This figure specifically is showing the net settlements in FPP and regulation FCAS aggregated by the type of generation. And the results are based on an 80-day analysis, backcast analysis, and this was done in 2021. So what we are seeing here is the positive net settlement, which basically shows the amount that the units received, the net amount that the units received over the period of analysis, and the negative net settlement, which means the cost that the units paid over the whole period of the analysis. And this has been shown for both FPP and regulation FCAS. The positive net settlement in regulation FCAS is of course based on the regulation FCAS market, not the FPP procedure. However, the recovery of regulation FCAS and also the positive and negative net settlements in the FPP is determined based on the FPP calculation process. So what we are seeing here is that the net settlements of the FPP in total is something between 20 to 50% of the regulation FCAS. However, something to note here is this was based on the data in 2021, and also it doesn't include the behavioral change that might happen as a result of implementing this procedure. But if you like to see more results of this analysis, you can find them on the slide pack that we published last year for the briefing in February 2023.
Thanks, Sahand. Finally, as I've said, under the FPP reform, market participants will be rewarded for helpful performance and penalised for unhelpful performance. The amount debited is strongly linked to how closely a unit followed its reference trajectory. Facilities that deviate from their reference trajectories in an unhelpful manner can expect to receive FPP penalties. Market participants can improve the alignment of a unit's behaviour with its reference trajectory in a number of ways. Firstly, capital investments in technologies that are able to follow plant set points more closely and provide PFR would improve the FPP outcomes of variable renewable energy facilities such as solar and wind farms. For example, the helpful performance of a co-located battery can compensate for the variation from solar and wind farms, especially when their generation falls short of forecasted output. Units can also compensate for the inherent limitations of forecasting variable renewable energy output by increasing their headroom. If facilities have a larger buffer for when they cannot meet their targets, they can reduce the degree to which they deviate from their reference target at that time. A final method to improve the outcomes of FPP is by improving the accuracy of self-forecasts. The expected output provided to AEMO by participants who self-forecast directly impacts their reference trajectory, assuming there are no limitations in the network. The more accurate these forecasts are to their actual output, the smaller their deviations. That concludes my section of the presentation. I welcome you to come forward with any questions you may have.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. We have a few questions here, a couple that I have answered in the chat and I'll go through quickly, and then a couple that I think are for Sahand. So firstly, Yi Leong asked, when is the expected sunset date for mandatory PFR? The answer to that is that the sunset has been removed. It's now an enduring obligation, and that rule was part of the same rule change that introduced the FPP regime we're here talking about. And then Luke Wilkinson asked if AEMO will publish the frequency at 4-second intervals. The answer to that is yes, we will be publishing a great many things at the 4-second level, and I will talk about that in the second half of the presentation. But then turning to the other questions that I'll ask Sahand to answer just so he captures the nuance for you. Luke Godley has asked, will a unit which is bidded into and dispatched by the regulatory FCAS market receive both a positive FPP CF and their regulatory FCAS compensation? Sahand?
That's the possibility. Of course, it would depend on if at the time that the unit was providing the regulation service was on the right side of the frequency. Based on our analysis, the correlation between the regulation FCAS service and the frequency is high. So yes, they would receive, if they have a positive contribution factor, they would receive FPP as well as the regulation FCAS compensation.
So the nuance there is that they're not always correlated, that you're providing reg FCAS and you have a contribution factor, but probably more often than not. Does that answer your question, Luke? Is any follow-up questions there? I'll assume
Thanks.
yes. Oh, I see. Yes, thanks. Excellent. All right. Next, we'll go to Louise England's question. Has FPP been tested on historical market data? Do we know how it improves or worsens the position of particular generators?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, basically we tested the FPP on 80 days of data that of course included both historical market data and 4-second data of generators. In terms of which units will receive more, you can see here that, let's say, the fossil fuel-based generators, because they're providing more regulation FCAS and also they have the PFR capability, they received most of the positive net settlements within the FPP, but it can change. And of course, this is based on the data in 2021. And at that point in time, we didn't have many battery storage systems in the NEM. Now it has changed, so we expect that the data would be different at this stage. But in terms of which particular units would receive more or less, as a result of the FPP, it completely depends on how good their frequency response is, and that depends on both the PFR and also regulation services.
Thanks, Sahand. Questions are coming in, which I love. Thank you. Please keep them coming. The next one is from Liam McManus. Has AEMO considered how it will replace data when units are sending bad quality data to AEMO and NSPs? And I can bring up the DCF slide if that would be useful, Sahand.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, that's actually a very good question. And we consider different scenarios that might happen. But in short, if in a 5-minute interval, a unit has more than 7 4-second of bad quality data, we will not use the real-time performance of that unit in the calculation. And instead, we will use the historical performance of the unit for the calculation within that interval. So in short, if a unit has bad quality data, we will use the historical performance instead of the real-time performance, because the real-time performance won't be reliable.
So we have a backup for that scenario. It's obviously something that is anticipated from time to time.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. So just a quick follow-up, if that's okay.
Please. Yeah.
One use case I was thinking of, which is sort of a bit of a historical one a year or two ago, when I remember a Victorian wind farm sent bad quality data to AMO for several hours and was doing several hundred megawatts different to its target. So it was doing, 0 and the target was 400 or something like that. In that instance, would they receive a default factor?
Did they have a bad quality data? I mean, could
Yes.
we? Okay, yeah. In that case, we will use their historical performance to calculate their default contribution factor.
Okay, yeah. So I guess in that instance, they're sort of being punished in historical terms as opposed to 5 minute by 5 minute terms.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the data that has bad quality would of course be excluded from the calculation. So if a unit has bad quality data and it has a very high deviation, those deviations would be excluded because we think those deviations won't be reliable to be accounted for in the calculations.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Trevor Lim, who says, I understand that the participant self-forecast is only accepted and updated in AEMO's systems every 5 minutes. Can the market systems be updated to receive self-forecasts more regularly, since comparisons against performance are every 4 seconds? Don't know if that's a question for you, Sahand, or maybe Chris, to throw him onto the...
Yeah, I think Chris would be the right person to answer this.
Okay, so I guess just to clarify what might have been said earlier, the assessment of performance, although it is done with a granularity of 4 seconds, it's actually not. Our systems aren't going to be designed to do that assessment for every 4 seconds. So at the moment, it's not feasible for us to produce any real-time or 4-second data feed, both in terms of performance assessment or in terms of self-forecasting. What we will be doing, however, is every 5 minutes at the end, after a dispatch interval has finished, when we perform that assessment with 4-second granularity, is we will be publishing the results of that calculation with 4-second granularity. So yeah, just to clarify, yeah, we are not actually doing the performance assessment every 4 seconds.
Thanks, Chris. Please feel free to sing out if you have. Oh, Trevor, you've said thank you in the chat. Thank you for that. Chris, this might be another one for you, coming from Priyank Kanji. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Any consideration around potential delays between the generated measurements being taken and the actual measurement data being received by AEMO? Noting, as per my understanding, AEMO does not receive time-stamped SCADA data.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, so at the moment, the design of the SCADA system does not timestamp the data at the source. So when the measurement is actually taken, that is different to some of the newer technologies that are used. The HSM and other type of data, that it is actually timestamped at the point at which it's measured. So effectively, AEMO only timestamps the data when it is received by our systems. So at the moment, and continuing on to FPP, we don't make any adjustment or allowance for any time difference between when the measurement is taken and when that reading is ingested into our systems and time-stamped within our systems.
Thanks, Chris. And just to complement that answer, so in the FPP design and specifically in the frequency measure, which is basically the metric that shows if a unit has provided helpful or unhelpful response, we accounted for a few seconds of delay in the SCADA data. So if a unit provides primary frequency response and the data has a few seconds of delay, we still will incentivize that response based on the FPP.
And I guess just to follow up on that, we certainly are aware that if there are instances where there is a persistent delay occurring within SCADA, that's actually managed under what we call the Power System Data Communication Standard. So it actually sets out obligations on participants and on the intervening facilities, typically operated by TNSPs, around the delivery of that data. So if we are seeing issues in terms of delays, the Power System Data Communication Standard is the way that is typically managed. Back to you, Ollie.
Thank you. Next question is from Louisa. Excuse me. Will AEMO still provide ASEF and AWEF, or push facilities to take more responsibility for their own forecasts?
I'll take that question, Ollie. So as part of the implementation of FPP, it doesn't change in any way the current arrangements to do with forecasting, both for wind and for solar. Participants will be aware that there are mechanisms now that enable participants to perform self-forecasting. That's entirely at the discretion of participants. AEMO's existing systems do provide, I guess, a mechanism which could be viewed as being as a fallback if participants don't elect to take self-forecasting up. Those arrangements are not changed by FPP at all.
Thanks, Chris. As always, Louisa, if you have any follow-up, please sing out. Otherwise, we will move to the next question from Peter McCarthy, and this is a request to talk through the RCR graph on slide 14 a little bit more. I'll take us back there, Sahand.
Thanks, Ollie. So as was mentioned in this presentation, RCR is the scaling factor for the FPP trading amounts. So the bigger the RCR, the bigger the payments. It is determined based on the gross aggregate of all deviations in the regulation FCAS requirement. So let's say we've got a regulation FCAS requirement for mainland regions, and there are 400 units that are within that requirement. So we have 400 deviations at each 4 seconds. To determine the RCR, we look which units have provided helpful response in each 4 seconds, and we sum up all the helpful deviations, and then based on the maximum of the size of helpful deviations within that 5 minutes, we determine the RCR. So what you're seeing here in the dark purple is the helpful deviation. And as you can see, the maximum of those helpful deviations are chosen as the RCR value within each 5 minutes. Does that answer the question?
Is there any other aspect, Peter, you'd be interested to hear Sahand talk about?
Hey, hey folks, thanks. I might just come off.
Yeah, please.
Come off mute. It's easier than typing out. I was just curious. The purple curve looks to be the same shape on the positive and the negative side of the axes, and I wasn't sure if that's expected, or is it just assuming that there's like equal positive assistance and an equal negative assistance, or is that realistic in actual fact, or just there for an example?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So we've got the 4-second data of units from the SCADA measurements, but at the same time, we've also got the residual, which is the deviations of units that do not have appropriate 4-second metering. And we assume that the deviations of residual is the opposite of sum of all other deviations. As a result, you can see that the positive and negative deviations are symmetrical in the figure. So that's expected.
Okay, thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Sahand. Now, the next question in the chat sequentially comes from Ron Logan, and goes to a point of concern that Ron in particular has had about an aspect of how FPP will operate. And I'll read the question at this point. Will AEMO have implemented the change to issue dispatch instructions for the start of the dispatch interval to align unit performance with the target trajectory? So, Ron, feel free to.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
I'll take the question. Thanks, Ollie. So thanks for the question, Ron. So just to clarify, we are currently investigating the options and feasibility of potential changes to dispatch timing and any opportunities to remove the offset between the start of an interval and when dispatch targets are made available to participants. But at this stage, we don't have any firm plans or timing around any changes, but we would certainly be letting participants know well in advance if there are opportunities and if so, when those opportunities might be implemented. The primary way that we'd be doing that is through the NEM Reform Electricity Wholesale Consultative Forum. So if participants wanted to know more about that and wanted to be part of that discussion, then I'd welcome anyone to come along to that forum. It's held on a monthly basis. But thank you for the question, Ron.
Yes. Ron, you're a regular attendee at those forums and very involved in the discussions, but also happy to give you this opportunity to comment in relation to the question.
Thank you, Ollie. And look, it was more to raise awareness with the participants on this forum today who probably haven't been involved in the early FPP workshops and that, and also in the NEM wholesale contest. It is an issue that there's a 20-second misalignment between that's in fact that 5-4-second reading. So there is a misalignment between what the units are being told to do by AEMO systems and what we're being measured against. And I would like to hope that we can get that misalignment removed, if not before, as early as possible. Otherwise, everyone's going to have this misalignment in their FPP payment. So the purpose of the question was to make sure that everyone was aware that this is going to happen to them.
Thanks, Ron. And as Chris said, it's an ongoing conversation. Now, the next one is also from you, Ron. It's a follow-up to what Priyanka was saying. Will participants have the potential to forward their local frequency readings to better align measurement and performance?
So in the FPP, we will use the regional frequency. So frequency data used to determine the frequency measure will be for each specific region. And we don't expect that the local measurements at each plant and the regional frequency when power system is running on a steady state would be materially different. So we had this discussion, I think, through the consultation, and at the end, the decision was to go with the regional frequency instead of units for each plant.
Yes, we had the discussion during the workshop. I know that's what AEMO decided. There was also concern with the SCADA delay that again we could end up with a misalignment with what units were being judged against versus what they were actually doing. And one of the suggestions was, which we never got a yes or a no to, was to allow the transmission of the local frequency, which, as you correctly said, should align fairly well with the regional power system frequency measurement. It would allow you at AEMO to line up units performance using the SCADA frequency measurement. I would still like to think that can be considered because we never got a yes or no on that. We agreed with the local frequency, the regional frequency being used, but we never got an answer as to whether local frequency could be used in order to create a better alignment with what we were being measured against due to the fact there could be SCADA delays?
I'll take that one. Thanks. So for the avoidance of any doubt, Ron, the answer to that question is no. The FPP solution that we are currently building does not have the facility to be able to take individual local readings from each unit. We have made allowances for regional frequency to be based on a number of different measurement points with a hierarchy to ensure that we achieve a more reliable regional frequency. But at this stage, our solution does not allow for separate locally measured frequencies.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks,
Bit of a pity,
Chris.
but at least we know where we are now.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And yes, we'll try and avoid getting too much into litigating the finer points in this information session. We have other forums for that. Moving on to Edward Woodford's question. In the simulations you've run with FPP, do you have any results on how it might impact frequency? i.e., do you expect frequency to become more stable after FPP is implemented? Back to you again.
Yeah, no, I mean, in the simulations, we didn't consider the impact of providing the response because it was a backcast analysis. It was based on the historical data, and the potential changes in the behavior of units was not considered.
So I might just sort of follow up on that one. Certainly the policy objective of FPP is that it will incentivise better frequency control, and so the expectation is that as a result of that, that you would see the frequency being better, frequency control being better than without the FPP arrangements. Now, obviously, at the moment, we have a regime at the moment where there is mandatory PFR, but there is no incentive arrangement in place. So participants obviously are already required to provide narrow deadband frequency control right now. So whether or not FPP does ultimately result in a change of frequency control is hard to say, but certainly the policy objective is to ensure that there is stable frequency control on an ongoing basis and ensure there are incentives for that control to be provided.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you for that acknowledgement, Edward. All right, next we have a couple of questions from Yvonne Tuckett. Could we please get some clarification around auxiliary load? Two-part question. Does FPP apply to batteries that offset auxiliary load? And do the payments/penalties apply if we impact frequency for auxiliary load only?
So if auxiliary load is part of a power unit, then we will consider the SCADA output of the unit, which comes to the AMO. And in the cases where there are units that are in the same aggregation set, which is described in the FCFP, frequency contribution factor procedure, we will aggregate the deviations of the unit and then determine the performance for all units that are in the same aggregation set.
I think maybe just to expand on that one, and it's probably a question, Yvonne, we might need to take offline and discuss and provide some more detailed information. Typically, auxiliary loads are not individually assessed for cause of pays at the moment, and so will probably not be assessed individually for FPP. However, as Sahan pointed out, if they are aggregated together with the actual generating units themselves, then that may involve a different treatment. But yeah, it might be one that we do need to take offline.
Thanks both.
Thanks, Yvonne. Another question from Ron next. Given that the price paid for FPP is the Reg FCAS price, changes in Reg FCAS requirements will have a significant impact on FPP. What is AEMO's intent with regards to Reg FCAS procurement requirements once FPP commences? Is there a risk that FPP will be used to reduce Reg FCAS requirements?
I'll take this one. So at the moment, we don't have any intention to change the way we determine the requirement for Reg FCAS following FPP. So at this stage, we haven't considered any change to the way we procure.
Pause for Ron. I think are you okay with that one, Ron? I'll assume yes.
All good for me to hear that you no longer have an intent to review it.
Thanks. Next question is from Anthony. Following on Roland's question above, what has been the historical split between PFR and regulation FCAS in terms of megawatts? And when does AEMO choose to use PFR over Reg FCAS? Is there a threshold? Chris.
I'm not sure I've got a.
Yeah.
I've got a. So, Handy, do you have any data to support this one?
Not really, because PFR is a local response, so it's not a coordinated response that AEMO asks units to provide. So there's no megawatt capacity in terms of how much PFR in total units have provided. We have the data for regulation FCAS, but no data for PFR because it's a local response at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think there's any way for us to actually determine what the split between FFR and regulation FCAS is. So I don't think there's necessarily anything that we can assist with there.
Ron, you got your hand up?
I was just going to say, if we look at that chart on slide 14 on the screen, was that compiled from real data or is it stylized?
It's from real data.
Okay, so that probably provides kind of a sort of indication of what it is we might be looking at in that if you think the reg quantity was probably in the order of, let's say it was 200, then the what we're seeing there in the RCR is showing that PFR during those periods was probably providing about twice the frequency response that reg was during those dispatch intervals. It's just a thought. So that sort of chart that you have there, if you had a chart that went for a day or something, that might give people more of an idea of just how much work PFR is actually doing.
Yep. But I mean, that's assuming that all the deviations are either the result of PFR or the result of regulation FCAS, but that might not necessarily be the case. However, yeah, if we assume all other deviations apart from the regulation FCAS is for the PFR, that's true.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, a hand. Next one is a more simple. I can cover Liam's question in terms of what is the last month of the causa pays process, as I will cover in the following slides. That process will run until the 7th of June 2025, and then FPP kicks in on the 8th. Next question from Mitchell Taylor. Has AEMO considered adjusting the dispatch conformance logic to not give off targets for being outside the error threshold when providing positive frequency contribution in the form of PFR?
I'll take that one. So we are certainly aware that there is a potential challenge with units being outside of their normal conformance bands when providing PFR. I'm not aware of any intention to address that in our dispatch procedure, which outlines our automated process for non-conformance, but I can certainly take that as an action, and we can have the people that look after our non-conformance process follow up with you on that one. Thanks, Mitchell.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Mitchell. So we have 3 more questions, and then we should spend the last half hour on the second half of the material. Another question from Priyank, not quite related to FPP, he supposes, but does AEMO have any plans to update the SCADA system to accept timestamped data?
I'm not sure whether anyone else on the call has any more detailed information, but I don't believe so. I know AEMO is working on some alternative arrangements for the provision of SCADA data, what we call SCADA Lite, but I don't know whether that does involve there being timestamp data associated with it. I don't believe so, but yeah, we can certainly take that as a question and follow up with you if you like on that one, Priyank.
Thanks, Chris. Yvonne asks, do AEMO know yet if we'll see settlement items for PFR/FPP as distinct from Reg FCAS, or will they be bundled?
That might be one for me again. So the answer is they will be separate. So certainly from our perspective, and I believe we have laid this out in some of the workshops that we've had around settlement reporting, is that we will very much distinguish the different components within, not at the settlement statement level, which is sort of the high level energy and ancillary services, but the next level of detail down in terms of what we normally refer to as the settlement report, the SR. The expectation at the moment is that they will be broken up by the different components.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Yvonne. We have Rowan Rogers with us, but he's having trouble accessing the chat. But he's asked via email, is the frequency signal used in the FPP the instantaneous number at 4 seconds, or the aggregate of the around 200 cycles at 50 hertz? Is that for you, Sahand?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Can you repeat it?
Yes. Is the frequency signal used in FPP the instantaneous number at 4 seconds, or the aggregate of the around 200 cycles at 50 hertz?
No, it's the instant measurement at each 4 seconds. However, just to clarify, we are not using the instantaneous frequency deviations as the measure. We are using a smoothed version of that because we appreciate that instantaneous frequency deviations might not be the best metric to see if a unit has provided helpful or unhelpful response. So it's a smoothed version. We use a smoothing function to do that. And we've done a comprehensive amount of analysis on this, which you can find on the draft report of the FPP consultation published last year.
Thanks, Sahand. Ron has another comment about time-stamped SCADA. Ron, we will include you in any follow-up on that topic, and if anyone else also wants to be part of that, please identify yourself, and I imagine if it goes anywhere, we might include it through one of Chris's forums that he chairs. Liam McManus has a broader question than FPP, but still related. Is there any monitoring and enforcement of the Datacom standard? Given more market processors are moving towards real-time / 5-minute data, the quality of the data being good is increasingly important. I understand the standard has some references to quality of data.
Probably don't have the right people on the call to answer that question. So I couldn't comment really around what monitoring and or enforcement there is. I certainly do know that where there are instances where there has been power system incidents which have been identified during our investigations as that SCADA data has been a contributing factor to that. certainly there would be enforcement of the standard in those instances. But yeah, I'm not in a position to be able to comment on what broader monitoring and enforcement of the standard that we have.
And just to complement that, and just beyond the comms standard, from the FPP solution, we are doing our best to capture all the instances of bad quality data that can be found, and we will continue to do this because we appreciate that this is a real-time system and the quality of data is, of course, very important.
Simon, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, on the Datacom standard, I recently noticed in the latest version there was an obligation on every participant to update their signal accuracy details. The dates for that were the 1st of January this year, but I have not been able to locate the person or people or inbox for that AEMO requires to send that information to. And when I've inquired about it, I've been told there's actually no steering process for that. But I do encourage everyone to get that Datacom standard, have another read of it, because it has been changed in recent years. And the accuracy information is now required to be a lot more specific and updated than what it was before.
Thanks, Simon. And Liam, yes, I see your follow-up in the chat there suggesting that a session on that topic at the EWCF. Thank you. Let's turn now to the second half of the material, the smaller half, which is the implementation of the reform, and I will be talking through these slides. There is so various, well, there's this timeline and some other tables in these next slides. I'm not going to talk to all of them. They are to an extent provided for your reference if you want to go back and look at the details afterwards. But to talk to some of this plan on a page that we have here, the top swim lane is covering the rule commencement and solution definition. What's our outcome? So we started back in 2022 with an AEMC decision, but then you'll see that we have two separate go live milestones, one in December of this year and the other in June of 2025. The first of those is not what we're calling non-financial operation. And this division between the go live of non-financial operation and the go live of the whole FPP regime, so the addition of the settlements part, that division exists throughout. It characterises the reform implementation process from AEMO's perspective. So you will see if we go down to the third lane, AEMO development and internal testing, we've got the two big lines there for the NFO and the FO. I will talk more about non-financial operation and what it is and isn't in later slides. That's probably enough to say about this slide for now, but if there's any particular detail you're interested in, it is there for you. Next, just to recap the milestones that we have achieved so far, or the headline ones. So in May last year, we completed the update to what was an existing procedure, the primary frequency response requirements procedure. Obviously, there were changes to that necessitated by the rule change, and those were finalised in May. In June of last year, we published the final frequency contribution factors procedure, including the associated tuning parameters, which is a separate document because it has some numbers in it that can be updated by AEMO without going through the full consultation process required for the FCFP itself. And yeah, that procedure is, along with the rules themselves, supplementary to the rules themselves, really the parameters of how FPP will work. On the 30th of June, we published a participant impact assessment, and we went through the highlights of that with you in earlier slides. And then on the 8th of December last year, we published the high-level technical design, which I will talk further about now. So yes, we, as Chris mentioned in his introduction, FPP is part of a reform program, the NEM reform program, and through that program, we heard loud and clear, and it's a very fair comment, that in other reforms, the development timeline available to participants has been squeezed. And so in an attempt to provide a longer IT development runway for participants, we developed this document called the high-level technical design. What is it? Well, the first sub dot point there is just calling out that it has information that puts it in context as an overview of FPP, but more to the point, it contains the column names, business rules, and other information about the 15 reports that AEMO will provide to participants when FPP is operational, including at the completion of each 5-minute calculation. And to go with that, there is information about the current reports for causa pays that will be altered or discontinued from the 8th of June 2025. It is important to note, and I will reiterate here, that because we have published this document a little bit out of sequence in terms of the development of the FPP reporting data model, we do need to just have the little asterisk that there may be changes. We cannot definitively say that this is final in as much as that's ever possible with these things. But we have worked very hard to get it very, very close to what the final data model will be. And certainly we think close enough for it to be of value in you understanding the scope of what's going to be new and different. And you only have to wait until April to get the final FPP reports tech spec. To talk a little bit more about what's in that document, we have listed here the different reports that will be provided. I won't go through them one by one. I'll leave those who are interested to refer to the document. Other things to mention, though, are that the last few listed here, as you can see, are estimates. So we are providing some estimates as part of this. And so at the end of each interval, some of the data that we will be providing to facility operators about their own performance and outcomes will be confidential to them until the end of the trading day. But what's public initially and what's private initially or public from the start is made clear in the document. And as I said, the document also has examples of what the reports might look like. And I've got a sample here, I suppose, for the requirement for corrective response in the top left and the frequency measure in the bottom right. Okay, so the next two tables, this one and the next one, it's a list of milestones that some people might find a bit more digestible than the plan on a page timeline that I started with. Yeah, look, I won't go through it line by line, but here for your information and reference, and happy to answer any questions, is the sequence of development of things like readiness criteria and test plans and testing and go live plans, leading in this case towards the 9th of December go live of NFO, non-financial operation. We have the same for financial operation. The data model tech spec in that case will be published in September. And yeah, other milestones listed here. So just to drill now a little bit further into non-financial operation, NFO, what is it? What's the purpose and the opportunity that it is intended to provide? So it's an extended period of NFO. It starts around just under, one day under, it would be 6 months before go live of the FPP system, and it's intended to allow facility operators to familiarise themselves with FPP's operation and see what FPP outcomes would result from actual performance prior to the commencement of financial flows under the scheme. But as we've said, as Chris has said a couple of times, this really is all about giving providers and operators incentives that they can see in quick time and respond to. So NFO is further intended to that end to allow participants the opportunity to consider how you might respond, or they might respond to the price signals before the new rules take effect. And this is probably obvious, but especially where facilities might face poorer financial outcomes, this information will provide an opportunity for responses to be explored, again, before the dollars hit the settlement statements, so to speak. What will not be occurring in NFO now. So first dot point here is that NFO is not to be confused with industry or AEMO testing. That will have been completed. AEMO testing will have been completed before NFO commences. During NFO, the FPP calculation engine will be in production, and the engine will use actual expected participant dispatch levels and actual performance to produce and report FPP outcomes. But as I've said, money will not be settled based on these calculations, and therefore regulation FCAS will continue to be recovered under the current causa pays arrangements. Okay, I have here a list of available resources, and we have a few different things that we've made available, hopefully catering to a number of different needs. Listed first are the technical documents. The first one is the one I spoke to at reasonable length just now, and then the other two procedures. We have started to release readiness documents. There's one currently available, the draft industry readiness approach. There is a number of slide packs, including the one that we covered earlier, and I forgot to mention that I put a poorly identified link to the presentation from February last year in the chat here, and it's the last one here, FCFP Development Technical Workshop. Yes, the presentation that contains a number of other slides that look at the financial impact of the FPP reform, as the hand was speaking to. We also have produced a number of video explainers that drill in on different aspects of how FPP will work. Those are presented by Heidi and Sahand, and yeah, they go into more detail about the topics Heidi covered in her part of the presentation earlier. We have, I think it's 6 of those are currently available, and I have 2 or 3 more forthcoming. We also have some fact sheets here, both an overview of the FPP reform and one that goes into slightly more depth, but is still in the fact sheet style about FPP calculations and participant outcomes. The links in this slides, and we will publish the the slides and send them out to you again after the meeting, are to the individual resources, the PDFs, but they are all available via the FPP project page on AEMO's website, which is listed at the bottom there. The last thing I wanted to cover before we get back to questions was some information about how people can stay engaged with the reform. So as part of the NEM reform program, we operate a number of stakeholder forums, and the implementation of FPP is regularly discussed at those. So Chris chairs the first and last of those three, the PCF and the EWCF. The PCF is focused solely on the NEM reform program, whereas the EWCF takes in other matters related to wholesale electricity market, and there's a bit more room for the discussion of areas where there's not agreement, the maybe more policy type discussions. That one. Listed in between is the implementation forum, which is, as the name suggests, focused very much on the details of implementation of these reforms. All the materials related to all of those meetings are available on the page on each forum's page, and you've got the links there. And if you are not currently on the invite list for any of them, but you would like to have the monthly invites, just email us at nemreform@aemo.com.au. Finally, in the maroon box here, I'm mentioning that we intend to hold other sessions, other information sessions similar to this one, certainly between now and December, and probably beyond that. And the next one we would expect to be in the middle of this year. And further to that, if any organisations, groups would like to make a time for us to come and talk to you and give you a different cut of this information or an opportunity for a discussion, please contact us. We really do want to meet your needs. We see success in implementing reforms as being very much shared between ourselves and you. So whatever we can do to support that, we're happy to consider. That is the last slide that I have. I haven't seen any new questions in the chat. Does anyone have a question either about those slides I've just been through or anything else that's occurred to you while I've been talking? It would appear not. Chris or Sahand, are there any closing comments you'd like to make in that case, and possibly give people a quick chance to throw a question in there?
You go first, Sahand.
Yeah, nothing from me.
All right, thanks. I'd like to just thank everyone for coming along to this session, and in particular for all of the people that raised questions. I think the questions were really insightful, and certainly hope that for people who get a chance to go back and watch the session will also find the questions being raised as really useful. So thank you all for your time. I think we do have a follow-up question, Ollie, but you might want to just take that one.
Yes, thanks. So Louise England asked, how will the NFO data be provided to participants? So during NFO, data will be provided via NEM reports. We will be putting it there in the database for participants to suck into their own systems, and then at the end of each trading day, we will be publishing all the data to everyone, which I think happens via AEMO's website. Chris, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we what we refer to as NEM Web is typically the place where participants can access that publicly, but it is also available through what we call the EMMS data model, so participants can have that directly downloaded into their own databases.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Louise. Peter McCarthy has a question going back to our graph on slide 14. I will go back there, and Sahand, can you say how does he explain the orange residual area that is positive?
So as I mentioned, residual is the opposite of sum of all other deviations. When sum of all other deviations is negative, the residual deviation would be positive. I'm not sure if I'm answering that question, but if there's any follow-up question, please ask.
Hey, thanks for that. Yeah, sorry, it's taking me time to get my head around this. So the negative purple is reflecting the residual, and then on the one on the slide, the difference between the orange, which is residual, and the purple, which is residual. How do you explain that one again? Sorry.
So the orange one is the residual deviation, the orange, and the deviations that are on the negative side are negative deviations, and the ones that are on the positive side are positive. The difference in the color of the purple parts of the graph is because of them being either helpful or unhelpful, and that is actually determined based on the frequency measure. So if we sum up all the positive and negative deviations, we determine the sum of all deviations, and the negative of that sum is the residual.
Okay, cool. Okay, I think that makes, got that. Thank you again.
No worries. And as Oli mentioned, we have published a series of videos that explain each part in quite a lot of detail, the calculation process step by step. And in the video for RCR hasn't been published yet, but it will be in the next couple of weeks. So probably that will be helpful as well.
Yeah, I might check that one out. Thank you again for the presentation.
No worries, Liam. It's certainly a very rich figure, this one. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions here, so I think we can reclaim 7 minutes and leave it there. Thank you everyone again so much for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.